WWE superstars tend to travel a lot. I don't think I'm breaking any new information when I say that. Whether they're cramming into rental cars or catching red-eye flights, those contracted to the world's biggest wrestling organization are constantly on the move. So much so that the demands of the road, as much as the actual in-ring beating that they consistently take, can begin to wear them down. How lovely then that on the way back from an international tour in the spring of 2002, that WWE chartered an entire jet to take the crew back home. And get this, the drinks were on Titan Sports Incorporated. A bunch of tired wrestlers, a 7-hour transatlantic flight, and an open bar. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out a lot could and did go wrong, because that fateful trip from the UK to the US has gone on to be known as the plane ride from hell. The incidents were numerous and ranged from ribbing to fights to sexual misconduct to something that many feared could potentially cause the aircraft to drop out of the sky at 35,000 feet. It was a nightmare, with the consequences both immediate and long-lasting. A black eye for the publicly traded company that is still talked about almost 2 decades later. So just what exactly happened? How did it get to that point? Who was to blame? And who felt the brunt of the fallout? The following is the story of the infamous WWE plane ride from hell. First of all, let's talk about the tour. The tour itself was a relatively short one, lasting less than a week and comprising 3 house shows and a pay-per-view, which, let's be honest now, was practically a televised house show since it emanated from the UK. The Raw roster hopped from Cologne, Germany to Glasgow, then to Birmingham, before capping the excursion off with Insurrection from Wembley Arena in London. In all, 4 consecutive shows between May 1st and May 4th. Let's run down the crew on hand for the tour. It included Steve Austin, The Undertaker, Big Show, Ric Flair, Triple H, Eddie Guerrero, Rob Van Dam, The Hardys, Brock Lesnar, Scott Hall, Kurt Hennig, Booker T, Bradshaw, Crash Holly, Steven Richards, X-Pac, Justin Credible, Shawn Stasiak, Tommy Dreamer, Spike Dudley, William Regal, Trish Stratus, Molly Holly, Jacqueline, Jazz, Deborah, Paul Heyman, Jerry Lawler, Jim Ross, and road agents like Fit Finlay, Arn Anderson, John Laurinaitis, and Gerald Briscoe. And on top of all that, as I take a breath, there were referees, production people, management, and so on. So like, loads of people, like a big, weird mix of people that you could only find in wrestling. The tour was a successful one, and following Insurrection, they hopped aboard the chartered flight from London to Connecticut in order to make it back in time for Raw on Monday. But what happened between takeoff and touchdown was, well, yeah. Buckle up, folks. There's some turbulence up ahead. Now, let's talk about the flight itself. There are varying accounts as to who did what on the flight, but across them all, there seems to be a consensus agreement on who the main perpetrators were and what their various transgressions were. There's also a strong belief that the free booze and perhaps some recreational drug use were major factors in the escalation of things. Stories of people aboard this animal house on wings popping pills and discarding syringes are indeed out there. It all started out innocently enough, with Kurt Hennig and Scott Hall tagging people with shaving cream, including the Big Show, which surely can't be recommended. We also had a tipsy Gerald Briscoe trying to hug and kiss everyone, and other mainly harmless fun and hijinks. But as the liquor flowed and time passed, things took a turn. As far as the actual order in which events happened, who's to say? I mean, we weren't on the flight ourselves or anything, we've just read a lot about it and watched a fair few shoot interviews. We'd also guess that even to the majority of those that were on the flight, it's probably all a bit of a blur. Hennig got involved again when he goaded Brock Lesnar into a wrestling match in the aisle. I'd have to put him at about 6 beers deep at that point to think he could take down the Beast incarnate. Spoiler alert, he couldn't. This was not the first time this sort of thing had happened, mind you, as 1 year prior, Vince McMahon spent an entire long-haul flight on a charter plane trying to take down Kurt Angle. I guess the rule there is do as the boss says and not as he does. That episode ended, by the way, when The Undertaker woke up, saw the Olympic gold medalist on top of the CEO, and still in a bit of a slumber, attempted to choke out the amateur standout. But back to the plane ride from hell and Hennig versus Lesnar. The 2 Minnesota boys started with a friendly grapple, but they ended up going at it harder and harder, spilling close to the emergency exit, which naturally freaked everybody out. Right, so there's absolutely no way that it could have actually opened at such altitude, but no nobody was to know, and eventually the two had to be separated by Finlay, Heyman, and Triple H, among others. There was no heat on the next big thing for the incident, but Curt Hennig would have to face the music later on. Hennig's shaving cream partner in crime, Scott Hall, who, let's be honest, has been known to enjoy an adult beverage or two, didn't do anything particularly reckless, but the bad guy was inebriated to the point where people had to check his pulse. You know, to make sure that he was still alive and everything. When they touched down in the States, apparently Hall had to be placed into a wheelchair and led through customs, much to the disgust of many in WWE's upper echelon. One of the things that Hall was accused of after the fact was making sexually suggestive comments towards one of the female flight attendants. Not that he was the only one who did that, of course. Ric Flair rolled back the years and took off all of his clothes, allegedly strutting around in nothing but one of his shiny robes, flashing people and, according to a lawsuit later filed by two of the flight attendants, asking them to touch his nature boy. Goldust supposedly got in on the act as well, harassing those that were only trying to serve the bawdy bunch while spilling tobacco dip all over the nicely carpeted floor. When the Bizarre One hijacked the plane's PA system and began drunkenly serenading his ex-wife Terry Runnels with love songs, Jim Ross was forced to intervene and get him to stop singing to the mortified Marlena. He didn't do so at the first ask, which must have annoyed the announcer no end. Oh yeah, because, okay, so as well as being the voice of Raw, good old JR was also the acting vice president of talent relations and was, on Flight 666, living his own personal nightmare. Another man who was supposed to be a figure of authority was Michael P.S. Hayes, but the former Freebird departed the plane with a lot less dignity and respect, as well as an amateur haircut. Hayes, who was working as a road agent at the time, started festivities by hitting Bradshaw on the forehead, causing him to bleed from a fresh wound sustained at the previous evening's pay-per-view. Not exactly thrilled with having his clothes covered in claret, the big Texan promptly knocked Hayes out, at least according to some reports. The fun didn't stop there for Hayes, who very nearly urinated on Linda McMahon in the first class section of the plane, and oh god, could you even imagine? After Hayes had passed out, X-Pac decided that he needed a fresh new look and promptly cut off his ponytail, which he would then pin to a wall backstage at Raw the next day, next to a sign that said auction Freebird ponytail, proceeds benefit Alcoholics Anonymous. I think one day we should seriously look into just exactly how Sean Waltman managed to get a pair of scissors on board, but let's move on for now. When old Doc Hendricks realized he was without his mullet while on his way through customs, he went apoplectic and tried to fight just about everyone who was unfortunate enough to have been on the flight. Nobody stooged off the 1-2-3 Kid, of course, as many people felt as though Hayes had deserved it for his obnoxious behavior. How can you not love wrestling justice? Between unwanted haircuts, in-ring beatings, and wrestlers caught, there are few things in the business that are quite as weird. So yeah, all of that, and possibly more that we don't even know about, happened on that flight, and though it wasn't the first or last time a group of wrestlers had misbehaved while up in the air, the volume of incidents and the aftermath have seen this one go down in history as one of the more noteworthy trips in all of WWE. So now let's take a look at the aftermath. So just what did happen once everyone had shaken off their hangovers and showed up for TV to deal with the ramifications? Well, as you can probably expect, when Vince found out about everything, heads began to roll. Curt Hennig, first of all, was fired for his part in it all. He would have likely gotten away with the shaving cream thing since the world's largest athlete hadn't, killed him for it, but the repeated fighting with Lesnar, who was a rookie and just trying to stand up for himself, earned Hennig his pink slip, even if the official explanation was that the creative team didn't have anything for him. I'm sorry, but that makes no sense. They didn't have anything for him. They could have gotten months of material out of a smashed Mr. Perfect showing up and trying to take down the monstrous NCAA Division I heavyweight champion. That's a real missed opportunity, that. Scott Hall was also fired, but not for any one specific thing. His conduct leading up to and on the tour had been very poor, and the flight was simply the straw that broke the camel's back. Goldust wasn't fired, although he did come pretty damn close. Yeah, Dustin Rhodes was in the doghouse for some time after, but managed to work his way out of it, and by the end of the year, his tag team run with Booker T had been one of the genuine highlights of WWE television. Arn Anderson, Gerald Briscoe, and Michael Hayes were all reprimanded since they were supposed to be keeping an eye on the inmates and instead decided to indulge with them. Stone Cold Steve Austin was not impressed with Hayes and was notably ticked off with how the flight went, even though he and Deborah apparently watched a movie and slept the whole time. Not that Austin would walk out of the company for such a thing, you'd have to ask him to do a pointless job to Brock Lesnar to get that sort of reaction. There was no heat on Bradshaw or X-Pac, who were actually both viewed as heroes for their respective efforts. There was also no heat on Flair, because he put his nature boy away when JR asked him to, and really his antics were just seen as Flair being Flair, at least by WWE. That's because the two flight attendants who claimed to be on the receiving end of unwanted sexual advances filed a lawsuit against the company 2 years later, citing the extreme and outrageous behaviour of Flair, Rhodes and Hall. The dirtiest player in the game denied any wrongdoing on his part, and WWE eventually settled out of court. Jim Ross, the man who had to dish out the punishments, wrote about the flight from hell in his Ross Report column, and spoke about his disappointment in how the unsavory scene unfolded, claiming that alcohol would not be provided on future chartered flights. In the end though, the plane ride from hell was certainly serious and affected WWE and their business, but it didn't cause too much long-lasting damage. It was, after all, a small minority that made most of the noise. Much of what went down was not great, and obviously looks even worse in a modern post-Me Too world. Seen as the boys being the boys by some at the time, it was nevertheless unprofessional behaviour unbecoming of men who pretend to fight in their underwear. And WWE, to their credit, did clean up their act and keep the talent in line from then on, since something of this nature never really happened again. And if something like this happened today, the careers of all involved would probably be over in the time it takes to send a tweet. Thanks very much for watching. That was the plane ride from hell, and oh my word, I think I need a drink.